How's it going, Chasers? I hope you're having a kick-ass week. Episode number 18 of the Chase the Craft podcast is brought to you by Gladfield's sweet kick-ass craft malt made right here in New Zealand. If you haven't tried it yet, I thoroughly suggest you do so. It's worth a jam. The podcast is also brought to you by Adventures In Home Brewing, a brick and mortar and online store based in America that supplies for the home brewer, the home winemaker, and yes, the home distiller as well. You can even pick up equipment, stills and things like that. Buying from their online store is a great way to help support this podcast because it costs you absolutely nothing and they give me a kick back. They give me a little something. They buy me a coffee, basically for sending you their way. So if you want to do that, you can go to homebrewing.org/CTC. That'll take you to their specials page. Anywhere you browse from there, if you buy something, it'll help the podcast out, so thank you very much. I also need to say a huge thank you to the Patreons. Thank you so much, guys. You literally make this stuff possible. I cannot do it without you, so thank you so very much. If you're finding value in these podcasts or the Still It videos or the Chase the Craft website, calculators, whatever it happens to be, and you would like to help give back to Chase the Craft, you can go to chasethecraft.com/support to find out all the different ways you can help out. One of them being, if it's right for you, Patreon. Patreon is essentially a platform that allows you as a viewer or the listener to sign up and pledge support on a monthly basis, and in return you get a little bit of something back, like the new Patreon exclusive Chase the Craft Yeti merch that's available on 3 of those tiers. My guest today is Robbert Licorice from Ironroot Distillery. Now, I've had the Licorice brothers on the podcast before. It was one of the very first podcasts I put out, but I had to go back and talk to them again, simply because, I'll be honest guys, I'm kind of an Ironroot fanboy. Now, I love their product. I think their product is absolutely amazing. But the reason I'm a fanboy goes well beyond that. I love their ideology, the way they think about creating spirits. I love the way that they research things. I love the way that they experiment with things. Just everything about the way that they run their distillery makes me excited that they exist. If I was going to open a distillery, if I was going to run a distillery, I'd be doing it the way they do it, or I would be trying to anyway. In this episode, I had to ask Robbert about what's been going on their Instagram lately. They've been growing corn, so we talked about their experimentation and their growing of atomic orange corn, and also about just the whole process of how you go about introducing a new heirloom corn to be grown in your area, the impacts that has on the farmers and what they do to lessen the risk for the farmers, but also the awesome benefits that gives the local community as well. We talk about their barrel program, their philosophy of Elevage, and how when the spirit goes into the barrel, your job's not done. You've got to keep raising that barrel, nurturing that barrel, guiding that barrel through all the way until it's in the bottle. And because of that, we also touch on how they approach blending and how it turns into a 6-month or a year-long process sometimes to really decide and settle on a blend. And right in the middle, we talk about something which I find really interesting for a new distiller, which is finding a balance between a core foundational product that pays the bills and still having room for creative expression as a distiller. So without further ado, let's get straight on into it. Here's Robbert from Ironroot Distillery. Robbert, take 2. We're back again, my friend. For those out there in internet land, we tried this yesterday and the internet gods were not with us. We couldn't even have a conversation.
Delay after delay after delay.
It was so bad. I don't know. Yeah, it's actually been a while since I've tried to have a conversation. It was probably a good 25-second delay and it just made things impossible.
It was entertaining, if nothing else.
Yeah, we're having 2 totally separate conversations. Yeah, no fun. Anyway, we're back. The internet is smiling on us today. So welcome, dude. Thank you so much for taking the time to have a chat with us. I have a bunch of things that I want to talk to you about, actually. I guess the main thing for this is that I would love to talk about your barrel program. We can get to that a little bit later on.
Right, yeah.
because I don't know. I guess it's not that you're doing things differently. It's just that perhaps you're taking inspiration from different categories rather than straight whiskey. So that's spoiler. Or no, not spoiler. Teaser for those of you when we get to it. But that's a whole lot of fun. But in the meantime, I've been checking out your Instagram, man, and I didn't know you guys were farmers. What the hell?
Mom's a farmer. She's got the green thumb. I kill everything, but she's been toiling in the field next to the distillery, planting new corns.
It's pretty freaking cool, man. And when you say toiling in the field, you've got like a little...
It's a little strip.
I can't think in feet, but yeah, it's like, what, 6 feet by 30 feet or something?
Pretty much. I think there were 100 and something plants or something out there.
That's pretty cool. So why?
Well, for us, we're always experimenting with new varieties of corn. And we want to, before I ask a farmer to grow it, I want to make sure that it can grow at all kind of in our conditions. So we always test a new corn. And then from there, we also are generating seed corn to be able to give to the farmer to plant for that next year. Because especially these heirloom corn, some of it, like we've gotten it to where it's like $20 a pound for seed corn, which is expensive. So we always like to grow a little bit. One, to make sure it grows, kind of we'll do a little test batch with it, and then we'll have some to give the farmers to grow a small field next year if we like what we get off the test batch.
Okay, cool. So this is not anything new for you. You've been doing this process for some time.
We do it basically every other year. It takes about 24 months from Mom to forget how much she hates doing it, and she'll do it again. So like our very first batch of Bloody Butcher corn she grew. Again, then last year, or I guess it was about 2 years ago, she grew another batch of some Amanda Palmer and stuff like that for us. So this year was the first year we chronicled the adventure of growing corn. But
it's pretty cool.
This year we did Atomic Orange, and so that's what I guess this is what it typically looks like right here. So you see a nice little orange hue, very small. It's a flint corn, so it's very, very small cobs. But we get to see a ton of genetic diversity. So even though all the seeds for the seed corn, or all the seeds for the corn were this color that we planted, we ended up with some that were yellow with kind of fun purple highlights, and then even some that were a little bit more on the red side, a little bit closer to a Bloody Butcher color. But you can just see, even within the same seed corn, you get huge diversity. And again, it should all create different flavors and different characters. So I'm really excited to see kind of what we get when we put it all together.
Yeah, totally, man. So how, as a commercial distillery, how do you go about dealing with the diversity in that? Like, so you're just going to take it as you put it all together and say that this random, like, Skittles effect of corn is what Atomic Orange is, and we assume that it's going to be in the same sort of ratios next time if we do it again?
So that's going to be that's the hope. And again, there's variety every year. So, I mean, it's kind of like when you're talking grapes and wine, there's different vintages that are going to be different every year. So it's going to have the same profile, but there'll be nuances and a little bit differences from year to year. It's the same thing with these heirloom corns. As they breed with each other, there's going to be small genetic changes over the course of every year. So you will see some flavor drift. You'll see some differences in how they come out. But it's, again, so on the commercial side, you are going to have a flavor shift probably over time as it breeds with itself. But again, you still get a pretty good idea of what the general character is overall. So you can have a variety, just like in redheads. You have some that are strawberry blonde, some that are super red. So you kind of, there's all sorts of gingers out there. So it's same thing with the corn. It's you'll sometimes get probably more of certain characteristics, depending on the year and which plants perform better that year. So, yeah,
cool. Yeah. For those of you that are not in the know, actually, this is probably a good way to go back to the fact that you're. A lot of people say that they are a family business, right? But you guys are literally a family distillery.
Yeah, brother, mother, myself. We've got a couple people we've adopted into the family now. Ashley, Seth, Josh, and Gretchen. Probably Patrick Cohn before too long if he's not careful. And then my dad, my dad's officially retiring at the end of August, and so he's going to get about 4 days to be retired, and then he comes to work down here. So the real work begins.
Excellent. And the reason I say that is because there's an ongoing joke that long may it live of the whiskey gingers down here, guys. So that's why we were talking redheads and the very various specific natures of different types of redhead. I'm sure this will come up multiple times throughout the podcast. So beware, guys. Here it comes. They steer into it. They're proud of it. I have to ask too, with that small amount of plants, you said there's about 100 plants, and you're trying to get seed stock out of it. I've seen the size of your still. How on earth do you manage to do a test batch and figure out anything to do with this corn? Are you using it in tiny percents in a larger grist, or have you got a little pilot still? Or?
Typically, we're going to use it for, even on our normal mash bills, we'll start out at 5%, and we'll play between 5 to 15% with the heirloom corn. We've done some Bloody Butcher at 30, 35%, but most of them we play between 5 to 15%. With this small amount, we actually have we have actually 4 stills at the distillery. You have the big Vendome pot still that you saw. There's actually a little guy right next to him. It's a little 40-gallon still that generally we do a lot of tests in. And then for stuff like this, for just really small test stuff, we have the gin still, the glass still, is a little 5-gallon still, and that's generally what we're going to do with this guy, is just do a little tiny, what does the white spirit taste like? And that's really going to be the deciding factor whether we move forward or not.
Okay, cool. So you'll run it at 100% of the atomic orange.
It'll probably be about 50%, 50-50, just depending on exactly how much grain, how many pounds we end up with. But yeah, it'll be probably about 50-50, just to kind of give us a really good idea of what that corn brings to what we're doing.
Yeah, cool. And when you say 50-50, what are you cutting it back with yellow dent? Or?
Yellow dent, yeah, local yellow dent. Basically, the one that's our base for most of our bourbons, and so just to know how they play off each other for the most part.
I feel like we need to bring this up because to the uninitiated, hearing 5%, heirloom corn in with 95% yellow dent. There is an assumption or a kind of a reflexive thought of it's a little bit like throwing a sausage down a hallway. But I've experienced it. Like you've shown me. I can't remember exactly what it was. I think it was purple corn and Bloody Butcher side by side at 5% each, I think. And the differences really were night and day. It's pretty crazy. What are your sort of thought processes and what are you attributing those huge flavor contributions from a small amount of the grist with the heirloom stuff?
I mean, even when you go back and look at some of the traditional bourbon mash bills, you're looking, a lot of them, they're playing around with wheat or rye at, anywhere from 7 to 12%. So it's really not that different than what's typically done. I mean, you have some 36% rye, you have some much higher rye, but the typical mash bill, that's pretty much where it is. And what we've found just through the years of testing, that the heirloom corns, they tend to be very, very expressive, very intense flavor-wise. And so that's where we found that 5 to 10%, we really were getting, the flavor that we're getting was about the same. We didn't see a huge difference between a 10 and a 5% and 10%. Now there's some that we will do a little bit more with. It just, as we learn about the corn more, we'll dial that into kind of exactly the percentage that we want for that mash bill. But for us, we found that 5% was really enough to really get a good idea, because the protein content is so potent and how the protein interacts with the yeast, that you really do see drastic differences even with 5% change.
That's pretty cool, man. It's really cool. And it is exciting for the future of the entire category, right? Well, any beverage that uses corn, really.
Yeah.
It's really exciting, man. And there's a whole new world or a whole old world to play with again.
Both, because and one of the fun things too is that we've been able to engage with some corn breeders, some farmers that's what they do is breed new varieties of corn. They're constantly playing around with older varieties and crossbreeding. So it's old and new because there's millions of combinations that you can make to try to create, quote unquote, the perfect corn that you're looking for. And so, I mean, there's no end to the exploration on this end. And for me, the most exciting part is being able that we've gotten farmers in the area to start growing these heirloom corn. So Bloody Butcher corn was never grown in North Texas for years and years. And because we came in and started getting farmers to grow it, other people became interested. Other distilleries, other restaurants started using it because it's so flavorful. There are several restaurants that use it for their grits. And so it's creating kind of its own little mini industry on the side of these seed companies and farms that are specializing in these heirloom corns now up here, just because we kind of helped push that rock down the hill a little bit and got them interested in doing it.
That's pretty special, man. I love that it is sort of bleeding out into other industries too. I hadn't even thought about the fact that now suddenly there's a local farmer growing this heirloom corn that no one could have before, and then suddenly there's a local place making cornbread out of it, or tortilla, or whatever. Right. That's pretty cool. So, yeah, like you said, there is literally just almost an unlimited potential in terms of which way people can take this, right? With selective breeding or genetic or whatever it happens to be. How on earth do you sit down? Like, how did you get to we're gonna fuck with atomic orange as opposed to nuclear blue, or I don't know, whatever else is out there,
For us, typically when we're going out, we get seed books every year that are, different seed stocks that are available. Talk again with the farmers that we're working with on breeding programs, and just start talking. We start looking for anytime that when they're mentioning the flavor of the corn, because typically when you see a corn, they'll be like, has great corn flavor. That's typically what it says, which, okay, great. But that's not really what we're particularly interested in. What we're looking for is when they start talking about there's something else. There's something unique about the sweetness. There's something unique about the flavor profile of that corn. And that tells us immediately that there could be something very interesting. And that's what's going to key us on to going down some of the rabbit holes. At least that's where we started. And now working more with the corn breeders and some of the people that have really gotten into it, you hear stories about this corn that was grown here by this guy, and it was the best corn ever for such and such dish because it was a spicy corn, or it was something that you wouldn't expect. And again, it's just following those rabbit holes, finding some crazy guy that's still growing this corn on his farm that no one else has seen forever, and it's kind of exciting. It's like a little bit of detective work. It's always just searching for something really interesting, and that to us is what's going to key us onto the next thing.
I guess what you're saying is that you don't really care about corn character because yellow dent gives you great corn character. So why go looking for more corn character? But if you can find something that gives you, like you said, it's peppery, or it's blueberries, or it's chocolate, then
exactly. I mean, yellow dent is that standard corn character, and it does it really well. And that's, again, most people's reference point when they're talking about flavor regarding corn is coming from that yellow dent. So generally when they're mentioning something, it's something that's different than typical yellow dent character. It's not that we don't like yellow dent characters, just it's fun to have other stuff in there too. So that's why we're really searching those out.
Yeah, cool, man. So now you've decided you want to try something, and you can source some seed stock. The first thing you do is you grow it yourself, so you're not putting someone else's livelihood on the line. Is that
exactly? Kind of with farmers, a lot of the way the farmers work is that they have to get insurance on the crop. So if something happens and their field floods or whatever, they lose everything, they don't completely go bankrupt because the crop didn't make it that year. Again, farmers, it's a tough life. It's a really tough livelihood. And again, a lot of them, that insurance is absolutely necessary for them. And insurance companies will not insure a crop if it hasn't been grown in that county, at least in Texas. They won't grow it if it hasn't grown in that county in the last 10 years or so. And so for us, one, we're testing it to see if it grows first. And then that next year, the first couple of years, we'll even go and guarantee to that farmer that we'll pay a certain amount, no matter what the yield is, for that farm to be land that year, or for that land to be farmed that year. So that no matter what, that farmer is guaranteed that they're going to make a certain amount of money that year. Doesn't matter if they give me 3 years of corn or we get a bumper crop. My goal is, one, to make sure that they have a livelihood that they can move forward with. And then we can also get basically a record of this grain being grown. And then once that happens, then other farmers can grow it, and it's something that can grow and move. And that's again, it's one of those things with agriculture that you create a little bit of a history of it, and then from there, other people are more willing to grow it, and we can do stuff where we can grow stuff for restaurants and for our purposes and for other distilleries and everything else. So I think that's again, for us, the biggest thing is just to make sure that we're not harming the farmers, because there's so few farmers as it already is in the U.S. just because of the way commercial farming is right now. That anything we can do to support them and make sure that they continue doing what they're doing, that's part of the reason that we exist, and hopefully for us, it's part of our legacy, that we help support small farms.
And you're so dependent on it too, right?
Oh yeah, if they don't grow it, I can't make whiskey.
Yeah. And especially because you guys have, I wouldn't say hung your hat on it, but it's definitely one of your points of differences is that you're going after these, like you guys are known for Bloody Butcher, right?
Yeah, and I think that it's something that I think with craft distilling in the U.S., a lot of people want to compare it directly to craft brewing, and I always tell them that's not the case at all. Like, craft brewing was really a revolution against bland beer. Craft distilling is not a revolution against bland whiskey. The big bourbon producers here in the U.S. make some phenomenal whiskeys. Just absolutely killer whiskeys, and they have for forever. So it really wasn't a revolution against that. It's just, for us, it was more of a looking at what else can be done. And for those guys, at least, going back 10, 15 years ago, they weren't really interested in exploring older grains. That wasn't something. I remember reading and talking to a couple of the older distillers, and they told me early on that all corn tastes the same.
Yeah.
And that was what their belief was, that corn is corn. It's just there to produce alcohol. And now they have a very different view of it. Obviously things have changed quite a bit in the last 10 years, but I think that was more of what kind of the point was, that there are all these flavors that don't exist in American whiskey that could exist, that we have the ability to create and put into our whiskeys that we haven't done. And I think that's been one of the big criticisms of American whiskey versus Scotch and malt whiskeys, is that in malt and Scotch, you have this huge breadth of flavors, and bourbon traditionally was a very narrow set of flavors, sweet, caramel, vanilla. But it can be so much wider if we use what we have available to us. And to us, that was what was interesting about exploring. And we can do it again with those guys. They need so many more tons of corn than what we do in order to produce stuff and to do something viably. And so it made sense that small craft distilleries should be the ones that would explore it.
Yeah, man. You are closer to the consumer. You're more agile and more able to sort of steer the ship in a different direction if you find something amazing. The very fact that you're a younger distillery and you're not set in your ways, all of those things are huge advantages for you to be able to play and experiment. And it is freaking exciting, man. The world of American single malt and of craft bourbon is, I don't know, man. I feel like Texas is in some ways leading the charge on a few of these things, especially, the fact that you're so young as a distilling state. But yeah, I don't know, man. I think when we look back in 15, 20 years, things are going to be changed around a little bit in the way that people perceive spirits from different countries. I mean, right now there's a huge thing with Scotland, right? You just can't get past single malt from, Scotch.
But also, you look at how long it took Japan to really take off and get respect for what they do and what they've done. I mean, of course, they've been doing it for 100 years now themselves, but it's, I think, opening people's eyes up to that there's something different out there, and that's a good thing.
I guess what I'm hinting at before, and maybe didn't even realize it myself, is that it felt like Japan copied Scotland. They faked it until they made it, and then they started to figure out how to make it their own from there. Whereas, especially with American single malt, it feels more like, fuck what they're doing, let's just do something ourselves. From the beginning. So that gives more potential for something crazy to grow out of it. I don't know.
No, I'm 100% there with you. I think that was especially most of the guys early on. They weren't doing anything even remotely close to what Scotland does. They were doing stuff in, partly in, column stills and then the new oak, and doing, why not do a 10% chocolate malt? Let's see what happens. Playing around with all that. And, again, some crazy stuff definitely came out. The early kind of experimentation, and I think it's fun seeing that industry mature and see kind of where things are going, especially as the whiskey gets older, and you just start seeing regions kind of develop in their own kind of style, and even individual distilleries, and continuing doing crazy cool experimentation and really pushing things forward even farther.
Yeah, man. How do you guys feel about different categories? Like, I know you're very, I guess, corn focused would be the way to put it, because not everything you're doing with corn is bourbon, is it?
No, we do quite a bit of corn whiskey as well. Some stuff for more American style whiskeys, or what they call DSSs, or stuff that are in finishing casks or non-traditional whiskey casks from the beginning. So yeah, a lot of what we did early on was that, but we've done a lot of experimentation outside of corn too. Like, we've distilled a number of different ryes. There's super high rye bourbon in the back that we haven't released yet. There's rye whiskey in the back that we haven't released yet. We've got 4 different single malts back there. We've got an Irish style pot still back there aging that I'm really, really happy with where that's going. I mean, for us, the bourbon and the corn whiskeys, that's all again what the distillery is built on. But that gives us a lot of room to play with these other areas and to allow them to age up. So like the single malt right now is 3 to 4 years old, and there's not a plan to release it yet. So there's going to be some much higher age statement stuff coming out from us on those ends, like our grape brandy. That's a kind of cognac methodology again for distillation, and how we went about doing it with some locally grown grapes. That's 5 years old now. And I think the kind of goal is about 10, I think, for the release on that, at least for the first time. So the same kind of thing with the single malt. So I don't know exactly how far it'll go, where we'll push it. It's one of those things that we get to really just sit, relax, and see where it takes us. So
you've got almost like a foundation of the business based on the bourbon, on the corn, and then that allows you the privilege of being able to mess with other stuff, and then you don't need to sell it now because the bourbon's paying
already doing its job on that.
Yeah.
So that's it, and that's kind of the plan and where we're going with everything regarding that. But that's what I like, is that we have such a strong foundation on the bourbon that all the other things, again, we can just give them time and really play around with cask size, finishes. Again, with some single malts and giant sherry butts. We've got some fooders we got stuff in. I mean, big 2,000 liter barrels essentially. That stuff's aging.
Those things are impressive, man.
Yeah. I think that's what's fun about going back into the warehouse for us, is that not only do we have the bourbons that we have to play around all the different corn varieties, but then when you feel like you're stuck in a rut with that, you can always go and play with some of the other things that are going on in the distillery. Like I think we have a wheated malt back there. I think there's a 30% wheat, 70% malt mash bill back there.
Cool.
Just weird. Sometimes we did some weird stuff.
So I'm really interested to hear what your advice would be for someone who's new to the industry. Whoops, let me get rid of that. It's making noises. In terms of finding the balance, right? So you've got this. You need to find your base. You need to find your foundation. You need to find something that you can bang out that the consumer is into, that is going to pay the bills. But then, as you said, you need kind of like a creative outlet. You need something to stop burnout and to make you have fun. And you also need to be able to be thinking about the future. And, what if bourbon goes away? Or,
exactly.
or what's going to be the new big thing? Or how do you find that balance? And because you need a certain amount of focus and a certain amount of delegation of resources to take care of that base.
You are 100% right on that. You're right on target. So I think when we were first starting out about a decade ago, there was one distillery that Jonathan and I went to early on, and they were like, we did 150 different mash bills this year. And I was just like, whoa, now I think that may be going a little too far. I mean, that's what they do and kind of what they enjoy doing. But we knew, like, for us, that was the very first thing. We need to figure out and master one thing first. And so that's why we really dove deep into the corn, really play around. That's the first, for us, 3 years were really just 100% sole focus on that. And then once we figured or thought that we'd really found our footing and kind of figured that out, then that next year, we did 95% that and started doing, again, bringing in some newer corns and kind of playing around kind of on the outside of what we were already doing. And then next year, we kind of came up with a plan with 85% of what we do is our core, kind of line up with some periphery, interesting corns or something like that on the periphery of that. And then 15% is kind of that play, that exploration. One, because you're right, you need a creative outlet. You don't want to get stuck in a rut. But two, for us, it's always other spirits outside of bourbon and whatnot. That's what's been given us inspiration. And a lot of times making some of those and really diving down some of those rabbit holes, playing, again, it inspired us to really look back on some of the things that we do with the bourbon and tweak our bourbon. And I think really understanding and learning more than just the base, the bourbon and the corn whiskey, has made us better bourbon and corn whiskey distillers. Better understanding some of the sour mashing, what you can achieve with some of that. Again, yeast blending. There's a lot of things that we did in some of these other experiments that we were able to bring back in and kind of help us kind of continually perfect and dial in what we do even from our core lineup. And to me, I think that's the biggest thing is, one, and getting your base down and then using some of those outlets, creative outlets, to better what you do overall. And I think that's, to us, was the biggest thing.
Yeah, cool. When you say that it took you 3 years to kind of get it down, was that after 3 years you felt like technically you had it dialed in?
We felt like we had technically dialed in to as best as we could with, I think for us, we needed to go outside and go look, because that's like, again, when I went over to France and when we, again, really started digging even more into things that we understood and had been taught, but trying to, for us, we'd been taught one version, one view of French methodology, French kind of technique, but that all been from one person. And so that was like, well, let's go over there and see what else France is going on in France. What other things that they do with it that, he may not have liked or he may not have done personally. Again, when you learn from a cognac master, then going over to Armagnac and seeing what the Armagnac guys are doing and what they're doing. And again, using that to inform everything else that we do. And so I think to me, that was the biggest thing. And that's, again, getting into really dialing in and understanding that Elevage, that barrel aging process that you were talking about at the very beginning. Our barrel program started out kind of as it was explained to us. Elevage was tasting barrels every, for the French, they do it typically every year. But here, because things are a little bit more aggressive, we do it every 3 to 4 months. And was tracking the barrels, getting the profile of each of those barrels, tracking kind of the peaks and the crests as those different chemical reactions are occurring, so you can start predicting the barrel, understanding what flavors are developing in your warehouse and which parts of the warehouse, which was really important. And then once we got over there, talking to some of them about coming up with what they call coupe de mers, mother blends, and kind of having concept of blends, and then within years, basically taking a year to really kind of perfect that blend, and not just watch the barrels make a blend, but it was watch the barrels make a blend, let that blend sit, taste that blend, and then add different things to the blend to kind of perfect the blend. Don't just make a blend and be done with it. And to me, that was one of the bigger changes that we had overall after going to France. One was also understanding, again, from them, not just watering stuff down slowly, but sometimes allowing certain barrels to go up. Previously, we had taken every barrel and just slowly diluted everything. But now we actually will take certain barrels based on, again, the flavor and how they're developing, and we'll let them continue going up in proof. So we've had a couple barrels that have hit 130, 133, somewhere around there proof-wise, where in the past we would have taken that and dropped him down to 115 just on that slide, rather than allowing it to go up into us. That's given us some really new flavors and some really cool stuff over the last 12 to 15 months that we weren't getting before, just by doing that.
Cool, man. Yeah. I think that's a really nice further teaser, and I want to pull the part further on that. But just to jump back to something that you mentioned earlier, when I was there with you in person, you guys drew a little Venn diagram for me of your conceptual flavor inspiration, I guess, and how you pulled inspiration from multiple different categories, multiple different concepts or ways of thinking about spirits, and then pulled it all back in to your bourbon, basically. Do you want to just talk about that really quickly? Because I think that touches on what you were talking about in terms of being able to go out from your base, from your foundation, mess around with something, experiment with something, learn a different technique, and then that makes your bourbon better, or your foundation better, whatever it is you're making better again.
So for us, we've been taught basically on the blending side the concept is kind of a blending triangle almost. And so it's looking at what flavors do you really want to make up the base, the kind of the heartiness, the most of the flavor of that particular spirit. And so when you're talking about bourbon, you're talking about vanilla, caramel, baking spices, and that's kind of putting that kind of visual in your head that's kind of the core flavor profile of what you're going for. And so from there, that's when when we're looking at barrels, we'll start identifying barrels that really accentuate that part of their flavor profile, that have a lot of vanilla, caramel, baking spice, those sorts of flavors. And we know that those barrels are going to make up kind of the majority of a blend when we're putting it together. Then from there, we start looking for what are kind of more we call mid flavors. So for us, mid flavors are going to be stuff like, especially your fruit profiles. So what type of fruit profile are we really looking for? Are we looking for something that's more like cherry, raspberry, or are you looking for stuff that has more banana, pear, or apricot? And so you're really looking at what type of balance of those type of flavors. And so from there, again, you're going to go back to your barrel warehouse, kind of choose those, because that's generally, again, when we're looking at flavors, we'll choose a subset of those barrels to go into the blend then. Less than what we did for the core flavor profile, but just a little bit, because that's going to add that kind of mid flavor. And then on top of that, you're looking at what you want them to be a very nuanced flavor. So for us, really light smoke profile, I think for us has always been the biggest thing. Like cedar note too. I really, really enjoy that comes from older whiskeys. Generally, sometimes like a leather, like sitting back in a chair, tobacco type notes tend to be for us nuanced flavor profile. And so from there, you find just a handful of barrels, maybe one, maybe even half a barrel that has that flavor profile that you're going to kind of add into your blend. And so that's kind of the way that conceptually gets put together as far as flavor profile wise. But as you're going into that, that's just on the flavor wheel. Then you also have looking at how the different barrels that have big mid palates, different ones have longer finishes, different ones have they come across spicy or become just super rounded and sweet, and just kind of looking at how kind of the proportions of those. And so it's kind of a when you're talking about the Venn diagram, you have the flavor profile Venn diagram over with kind of the mouthfeel and the way the spirit presents on the palate. And that's kind of the, how do you get those two things to overlap? It's kind of where the, I would say it's kind of like an orchestra a little bit, with that you have, the treble that has all the melody and everything going on, all the flavors you're looking for. And then that bass is kind of that, how that whiskey presents, how deep and dense those different flavors are that you're looking for. So for us, typically we want those dense, richer flavors to be the dense part of that flavor profile to really be based in the base notes. Again, that caramel, vanilla, baking spice, to be that densest, kind of darkest part of it. And then again, when you start getting to the fruit and some of the smoke and stuff, to be much lighter, not quite deep and dense as those other flavors, so that you get something that kind of hits on all different levels of the palate. I think is kind of the goal when you're trying to build it. And it's always at that end, a pursuit. I think for me personally, I really like the Japanese philosophy that you're always trying to reach kind of the top of the mountain, but you never quite get to perfection, and you're always trying to continually reach it. So
yeah,
for us, we're always tasting again. Oh yeah. So for us, we're always tasting against old batches, and we always blind it against old batches. And the new batch, we don't blind all our entire tasting panel selected as our favorite whiskey on the table. We'll go back to the drawing board and rework it.
So I guess that is a very cool advantage that a quote unquote craft distillery has too. It seems that there has been a shift in the perception or the desire or the understanding of the consumer, in that if I pick up, release 1 of a bottle, and then I go and pick up release 4 of the same label from a craft distillery, in some ways I would be disappointed if they tasted the same. Do you know what I mean? Like,
some of it would be really impressive if it tasted
it would be amazing. Yeah.
But yeah, no, you should see a development of a small craft distillery, that if that 4th bottling is not what I would say better than the very first bottling, then to me that'd be disappointing, because it's as if they're not learning, they're not progressing in their arts, they're not progressing in the way and learning from what they were doing. And to me, that's why I get really excited about craft distilleries. When you taste some stuff, you're like, oh my God, this is amazing, or I'm really enjoying this. I can only imagine where they're going to go from here. And that's kind of the excitement. With the big guys, I already know they've got a long practice of being great. And so, but you can see that progression in a lot of the craft distilleries, which is what gets me so excited.
Yeah. And I think it seems like there was a time or a perception, or maybe it was also too, as you start going through these layers of, God, I don't want to say whiskey appreciation because that sounds douchey, but when you start getting into whiskey, it's kind of like at the beginning you almost want McDonald's, right? Like, I want to know that I can go out and buy a bottle of Johnny Walker from anywhere in the world, and it's going to taste the same. And then you start getting down through the understanding and the enjoyment of the product. And it is, I guess my point is, it's awesome that consumers of craft whiskey are totally on board with that, because it means that you can take something that, traditionally might have been seen as a weakness, consistency, and turn it into a resounding strength that you can you can just keep pushing the bike, like you said, keep moving it forward.
100%. And I think that's even bled over to the big guys too. I mean, you look at Elijah Craig, their barrel proof releases now, they have A, B, C, D every year. And if people, they'll collect them and compare them, all of them against each other. And you can see even within major big brands, there's a fluctuation over time. And I think that's really fun to see and to acknowledge. Again, someone talked to me the other day and they were like, Jack Daniels is the exact same it's been since you started drinking it in the 80s as it is now. And my reaction to them was, I guarantee you, if you have a bottle from 1980 and you taste it versus a 2020 version, they don't taste the same. Even with the big guys, there's a flavor drift over time, just because it's inevitable. Yeast evolves, it changes. You have different blenders. There is a difference, and sometimes that's better, sometimes it's worse. It's mostly in the eye of the beholder at that point. But I think it's fun to see that you can see such dynamic shifts with smaller distilleries. One, because how many barrels you have to select from are much smaller. I think you're very much focused more on individual barrels than big guys. They're doing blending bell curves, essentially, that they need so many barrels from this warehouse, so many barrels from that floor, this floor, and that's what goes together to create that. And there's going to be shifts every time they do it. But again, when you have 200, 400, 800 barrels, it's there at some level you're going to hit a bell curve at some point.
Yeah. All right, man. Elevage. Let's do it. So to set the stage, I think you've kind of already done this, but let's drop like the one paragraph explanation of what the hell it is first, and then we can start a little deeper.
Elevage simply means to raise. The French use it as a term that they basically treat barrels like children, essentially, and their goal is that the spirit is born in the still, and then you raise it through its life in the warehouse. And I think, to me, that was a really beautiful thing, and really kind of a cool understanding that once the spirit comes off the still, your job isn't done. You don't put it in a barrel, stick it in the warehouse, and come back years later and it's cooked and done. That it is a process that you are constantly interacting with your barrels. And so whether that's taking barrels and moving it from one part of the warehouse to another. In France, they'll actually take spirit from one barrel and move it into a different barrel over time, generally from newer barrels into more and more used barrels, because they don't want to have the oak impact. If they've gotten the amount of oak they want, they'll put it essentially in an exhausted barrel, so it continues breathing, continues maturing, but it's not pulling any more tannin in from the wood. And it's a progression that they'll do that with typically. Also, it's going to be, again, changing proof. So in France, generally in the wet warehouses, in the wet shays or wet warehouses, they're going to go down in proof, and that's generally the way they're going to treat it. They also have, some of the distilleries will have a dry warehouse where they want to maintain proof, especially with older stock that's already hitting 43% or something like that. They'll take it and put it in there so that it won't go up or won't lower anymore. One, they don't want it to lose it, but if it also goes too low, the flavors can get off for them. So it's constantly moving barrels into different locations to encourage it to develop in certain ways. So it's kind of, again, taking a kid, trying to get best out of that kid. So we use a little bit of kind of a bastardized system of that, just because, excuse me, bourbon has a little bit different rules, obviously, than cognac and Armagnac. Like, if I remove that whiskey from a barrel, I can't put it back in that barrel. Like, once it's out, if I put it back in, now it's being finished, or it's going into used oak, and that's a no-no. So bourbon, where in cognac, generally they'll take an entire, year's distillation out of cask, blend it all together, reduce proof, mix it up, oxidate, and then put it back in cask. We can't really do that. So with bourbon, we're typically interacting with barrels on an individual level, where we're going in, and if that barrel's pulling on too much tannin, I might move that barrel away from the side, away from the doors, and put it more to the center, kind of a cooler area of the warehouse. I might lower the proof so that the whiskey is now extracting more wood sugar rather than tannin and phenol out of the wood. Again, if it doesn't have enough structure, I may move it closer to the side so it pulls more tannin, go up in proof. And again, it's a constant kind of play with different barrels and controlling that proof, making it hang out at certain proofs for a certain period of time. Every barrel is a little bit different. Some behave better than others, and some, again,
just like children.
Yeah, just like children. So it's a constant interaction process where we're, again, and for me the biggest thing is because you have basically the barrels don't just get better over time. They actually go through kind of wave pattern where it'll get better, and then those have a breakdown of the esters, and it can become more or less flavorful, and then those will reform to longer chain esters and become more flavorful. And I think that's kind of the whole goal, is to be able to track that. So I know when's the best time to select those barrels. I know exactly what those barrels taste like, when's the best time to use them, and in what blends, or to be able to control them to make them kind of the best version of themselves. Because we don't just try to make everything uniform. We want some to be super spicy. We want some to be really sweet. We want some to have more tannin and more structure. That way, when we're coming and putting that blend together, if that blend needs more structure, I can go grab that barrel with a little bit more tannin. If it needs more sweetness, I can grab that sweeter barrel. Or if it's got some funk to it, I can take the barrel that has a little bit of funk to it and pull it out. And it's by pushing barrels in different directions, we can really key in on the real profile that we want with the final product.
So it's almost more like you're building a pantry, right? Like you're going to have your meat and potatoes, and you want a buttload of meat and potatoes, and then you've got your spices, and you only want a small amount of that because a little bit goes a long way, but we really need something super spicy or super fruity or whatever it happens to be. So if the dish as a whole isn't giving the profile we want, we can add a little bit of this in to pull it or push it in the direction you want.
And to me, that's really where your complexity is really built in that way. If the barrels all taste the same, then you're very, very limited in the kind of complexity that you can get, because there's only so many notes that you have and that you're playing with. And so to me, that's what's so important about one, the different mash bills, but also, again, moving barrels in different directions.
It's a really interesting concept to kind of, it's a hurdle to get over mentally, right? Like it's almost, it took me a long time to think of it this way as well, as if you've got a bottle of whatever it happens to be, this is what this is and this is what this tastes like. So surely the best way to do that is to try and push every barrel of spirit that I'm likely to blend into this towards this flavor profile. That seems like a logical initial thought, but the more I talk to people that do this professionally, the more it just doesn't make sense to do that for the reasons you're saying, right? You need to be able to just deal with nature, and going back to the kids thing, kids are going to do what kids are going to do, and you kind of just have to go with it. So it's a really interesting concept, and for someone that has not been involved in this on a commercial level at all, there's two things that really kind of freak me out about trying to actually do this. Number one is, how on earth do you know what you're looking for when you haven't been looking for it for the last 50 years? Do you know what I mean? Because it's such a, okay, so I think that I want this, and I start pushing things towards whatever it happens to be. Banana would be great. I'm going to start promoting banana in some barrels, but then I figure out in year 6 that wasn't the best idea. Do you know what I mean? Like it's not an instant feedback loop. You've got to wait so long. So how did you guys sort of baptize yourself into that, I guess? Like how do you even get started?
Part of it's working at other distilleries and really, again, working under them of what they're trying to achieve and kind of how they go about doing it gives you a certain level of understanding and kind of experience. And then at some point it's kind of, you got to jump. You got to take the leap. And again, that's why we started out with kind of things that we understood the best and really focused our energies on that. And before we started getting outside of that. And so we kind of had a good place to jump from. And then just one, kind of having faith in your abilities to, if something doesn't come out exactly the way you want it to be able to kind of mold it into something that's either could be used in a blend or could be something that you can use one way or another. I think I have no fear that no matter what corn we distill, there's going to be a way that I'm going to be able to use it. And it may not be a single barrel, may not be something that will be great on its own, but it should be something that I'm able to really, really push in kind of a direction to be used as part of a blend or to be able to be useful to us in some way. Whether that's just loading it up with tannin so that it's something that can add in small amounts to blends to add structure, and not worried about the other flavor profile of it. If it's something that's not like a flavor that's more uninteresting to us. I mean, there's ways that you can go about and still use things that don't necessarily turn out the way that you want them to. And you have to have faith of yourself. I mean, I think that's what's so important about the blending side and understanding that is that even if there's something that you don't necessarily love, there are ways to use it that can actually make what you do better.
So it's almost like it's like your own little insurance program, right? So you make a barrel that's just bland and meh, or perhaps even is slightly funky, or there's something in it that's actually not that great. So what you're saying is you can just turn that entire barrel of bad whiskey into a huge tannin bomb. Just cram as much tannin as you can into it.
Yeah, or it could be it could be dropping the proof and turning it into something that's like a 40% that's going to pull a lot of sweetness out of that wood that you're going to use in small amounts to kind of amp up sweetness or caramel or something from that. And that's, again, you can go a lot of different ways with it depending on what the issue with the whiskey really is. If it's a really off flavor, then probably oak is going to be more of a something that will take on a lot better. But it could be a number of different things you don't particularly like about it. But you can do, again, between all the different techniques that you can use to turn it into something that's useful. I mean, the French do stuff that they call old week, where they actually take spirit. They're going to reduce, basically, they'll fortify water, is what I call it, because they make something that's a 20% strength, essentially. They barrel age that for 10 or 20 years, and they use that as what they use to dilute the final product. So rather than adding water to the cognac, they'll actually add that to it so that they're adding something that has flavor and character to it rather than just water. Basically, you're flavoring the water that you're going to be using to proof down.
And you're leaving just enough alcohol in it to make it interact.
To prevent it, to make sure that it's stable and everything. But that way you can use, so I mean, there's a lot of different things you can do to use spirit that is in your favor. That's still going to be very useful to the distillery long term.
Let's get into all the different techniques as much as we can in the next 15 minutes. But first, the second thing that scares the bejesus out of me with this is how on earth do you A, taste all of the barrels, and B, how do you track it? What like data collection mechanism / storage mechanism are you using to be able to look at? I mean, how many barrels do you have right now?
So right now we have around 800 barrels or so. So how do you taste all the barrels? So one, you don't taste them all at once. That's the number one thing. That would be a long day. Number two is generally we're going to give barrels at least a year. So not every barrel in the warehouse is going to be something that we're going to be up for tasting. So generally, I'd say about 600 barrels. So we'll break it up to about 4 or 5 days between morning and afternoon. Going through, and it might be 3 days 1 week, 2 days another week. It might be, over 3 weeks. So we'll split it up just to make sure, one, that we're not overdoing it, and palate fatigue is a real thing. Even when we're tasting and spitting. We're not swallowing just because, again, if you were swallowing after 10 barrels, you'd be pretty much gone. So for us, that's again, we're going to be splitting it up over a number of different days, and then. Again, generally we're doing about 20, 25 barrels at a time. And again, we might do a morning and afternoon session and do it again over that period of time, just to get kind of through them all. Long term, as we build up and have more barrels, hopefully we'll have another employee or two that will be able to help so that we can have more people that just focus on the blending side and prepping that. But it's very important to not taste too much and to make sure you spread it out so that you don't wear yourself out. And again, palate fatigue or burnout are definitely things to consider when you're really getting into it. I think for us, doing it as a group is really helpful because one, you're not left out there alone if you're having a bad tasting day where you're stuffed up or something like that, that you've got backup of people there to help you out and really get through it. And also it's fun to taste with people rather than just by yourself in a room.
So much more fun. Much more fun. So how do you then store that data so that at a snapshot you can have an idea of what you've got, or if you know you need sugar, or you know you need tannin, or you know you need blackberry, or whatever it happens to be? How do you know where to go looking for these things?
That's the secret of Jonathan. He's got that encyclopedia mindset that he can remember. And so for us, generally, we take very diligent notes. So every barrel has notes every time it's tasted, what the profile is, what we think, how long is its kind of trajectory of how long we want that barrel to age, or is it on track based on what we tasted the last time, kind of how how that individual barrel is developing, and then whether we think it's something that'll be a single barrel, something that would go into Harbinger, something that would go into Promethean, kind of what profile is that barrel really going towards, and so that we know when we're going to start working on putting a mother blend together, we have a group of barrels to start with, and we'll start by putting that together, tasting through it. We'll have the other barrels pulled so we can nose them all, and generally, very first thing is going to be just running through things on nose. There's something off on the nose, finding out which of those barrels is giving that character. Go ahead and pulling those out before we even start doing any sort of tasting. So nosing is probably 90% of what we're doing. Again, ultimately you need to taste because sometimes the nose and what it tastes like, there's a disconnect between those two things. And so really you want to understand that whiskey, but a lot of the initial side on the blending, when we're really digging into blending, is just done by nose.
So this idea of a mother blend, you call it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to explain that?
So Coupe de Mer. So that's basically where we're taking when we know we're going to do a blend, and we'll take so let's say we're making Harbinger. We'll look at all the barrels that we said are ready, that are in that Harbinger profile, so that base profile flavor for Harbinger. And we're going to gather those together, and we'll make kind of a mini blend out of that. And then from there, we're going to analyze. Yeah, a little test blend. And from there, we're gonna analyze that, kind of make a decision on what's it lacking, what's it need, where's it, how's it develop, how's that just as it sits. And from there, we'll either add or take away some stuff, and then we're going to sit there and let that sit for the day. We'll come back usually a few days later. Again, we want it to marry and really kind of integrate with itself. We'll reanalyze it and really make some notes of, all right, from here, since we've pulled out all the ones that we thought weren't suitable for the blend based on that first day, now we're going to be looking at more, what does it need? What do we need to add to it? And that's when it's lacking on the cinnamon compared to the last couple of batches, or it's missing a fruit. The fruit's just really not apparent on the mid palate. So then we're going to start looking at casks that have fruit on mid palate and start working on adding those in and really tweaking that blend. And again, it's a process that takes 6 months or so before we get to a final product. Because as we get that base kind of put together, what we like and what we want it, that's when we'll all start working on diluting it down to bottling strength. So before we pull anything out of cask, generally it's going to be within 1 or 2 proof points of bottling strength. Once we pull it out, we want to add as very little water as we possibly can to it.
So are you physically taking all of these barrels and blending them together like at the beginning of that 6-month period? Or is this like a desktop blending?
Yeah, it's desktop blending for us. Okay. So now there are times that we'll get to basically most of the way, 50, 60% of the way through the process, and we'll go ahead and pull those casks and blend it together and get like a better idea of what because again, pulling cask samples, you don't get the complete picture. It's really just kind of a starting point. So at some point between 50 and 75% of the way there, we'll actually physically pull casks, and then we'll start doing that final with the marrying. That's generally after, again, I've gotten those barrels down to that, basically the bottling proof.
Okay, cool. So once you've got maybe the first two tiers of that pyramid kind of sorted, you've got your base completely dialed in, you've got most of the mid tier sorted, and you're just looking for the seasoning that goes on top. You can, right, we're going to commit to this, and then we're going to look for that last sort of the 20% of the 80-20 rule sort of thing.
You nailed it.
Okay, cool. So you've talked a lot about proofing down, and I've talked to multiple people about this and got lots of different ideas on how, why, where. No, it doesn't matter. Yes, it does matter. But obviously you're proofing down slowly over time. I cannot remember the name of this right now. What is the name for that?
So again, that's for us, it's part of the Elevage process. It's part of just proofing down is what we call it.
Okay. So why? Why not just dump a buttload of water in there?
So first and foremost, there's a couple different things that can happen. Specifically from pot still distillate, it's going to be where more the concern is, where you're not going to be doing any chill filtration. But so if you water something down too fast, especially if you're going to like a 90 proof from cask strength, at 94 proof, you have something that can occur called saponification. Or if you add the water too fast, the whiskey will cloud, and also it will develop almost like a soapy note to it. And there's definitely whiskeys on the market that I'm not going to say, but it happens to. And it's from proofing too quickly, from pot still distillate because you still have some of the heavier fatty acids and esters and stuff, and you add that water too quickly and it saponifies. So that's definitely an issue. Definitely with non-chill filtered whiskey, it's a huge concern that you have. Number two is that you have the ethanol. When you hit it with water, it's going to break it down a little bit, and so the whiskey gets super agitated when you do that. It's going to heat up. You'll create actually an exothermic reaction with those. Basically, you're breaking the chemical bonds, and when you do that, it releases energy. Like if you do it, it's really fun when you reduce something at like 100 to 190 proof. You drop it down really fast to bottling strength, like the tanks. Like metal tanks will actually pop and stuff because of how warm they start getting, just because of that. So the flavor, the flavor doesn't hold together as well, and it would take a long time for that to recover.
So the saponification?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that is not reversible by sitting and marrying.
No, once that's happened, you're pretty much SOL. So
yeah. And then the sort of loss in flavor, you'll gain that back over time.
You can gain it back. To me, like in my personal experience, like it'll come back. But what I like gaining by doing it in cask is that water has a chance to actually absorb some of the flavor from the wood, absorb some of those wood sugars. And so the water, you're not just diluting something, you're adding it actually has a chance to actually gain some flavor.
So it's another layer of complexity.
Exactly. So you end up with something that's more flavorful than it would be if you just added. So if I take something that I've in cask watered down over time, and I take a sample from that cask and I add water at the very end, and I show you and I present them both to you, they're going to taste different. And generally, one's going to be a little bit denser, a little bit more flavorful, even at the lower proof. Just because of the nature of the water has time to absorb some stuff, and it's not just straight water.
That's a really good argument for that position, because I've heard a lot of people say, like obviously if you proof it down quickly, it's going to shock it. If you give it 3 months in a holding vat, it's going to get back to where it would have been if you just proofed it down over 3 months.
Yeah,
and I don't know, man. I've not A/B tested that, but you cannot deny that water is just water at that point in a stainless steel tank, as opposed to it's now water that's had contact with the barrel. That is I've not heard that point of view before, so that's really interesting to me, dude. I thank you. I find that helpful on the topic. All right, dude. So you've mentioned that there's all these different techniques, and we've touched on some of them. I know that we're actually over an hour already, so we'll try and...
Yeah, I'm going to have to run here in a minute.
Yeah. Do you want to whip through really quickly, maybe kind of the encyclopedia, couple of line definition of a few different, or as many techniques as you can get through quickly? I think it's one of those things that you don't know what you don't know, right? So if you tell us, like, for example, proofing the whiskey down in the barrel, sugar versus tannin, at least people can go and kind of, they've got something to go, a string to pull, to go and do some research themselves. So quick fire round.
Yeah, so watering down slowly, that's in cask specifically, you want whatever you're adding to the whiskey to have flavor as well. So that's why we do it that way, and that's, to us, makes most sense. And that's why, again, with the French, that they're doing that over long periods of time, because they want that water to have the most chance to gain the most amount of flavor. Other big things, again, you're trying to maximize ester production over the course of everything that we're doing. So between how you're handling your fermentation temperatures to even how you're handling the condenser temperatures, that can increase esterification based on how you're running that. And so that's something to really play around with, is how deep you want that steam to get into your condenser versus how quickly do you want it to turn into alcohol, and how much of that copper content you can get some ester production in there. Again, looking with sour mashing, there's actually some benefit to ester production through some sour mash, and so you get some really interesting flavors. I really encourage people to try doing stuff sweet mash and the exact same mash bill sour mashed right afterwards, and compare the two and see kind of what you get on those. And I think that I think you get some really cool differences between those two techniques.
Just to clarify, when you say sour mashing, you're talking...
backset, taking stillage, adding it back to your fermenter to help. Again, it helps control your pH level and everything else too, but you can actually amp up a little bit of your sour mashing. There's a distiller in Indiana from French Lick Distillery, Alan Bishop. He has a blog that he does that I really encourage people, if you want to get in the nitty gritty. He's one of the best distillers in the U.S., but he wrote a thing, it's the Alchemist Cabinet, I think is his kind of blog. Okay. And he wrote a thing on sour mashing and kind of the history of it, and it's really, really fascinating. I really encourage you to go and read. Again, he's doing some really crazy, fun stuff up north. But
awesome.
But yeah.
Cool, man. Anything else on the barrel care? You mentioned moving it from hot to cold, high airflow to low airflow. Anything else on the barrel side of things?
Taste barrels to different temperatures. Heat up the barrel, cool it down, taste it at different temperatures, and you can see even within a day, you can see differences in what's presenting in the whiskey, just based on what's pushed into the wood, what's pulled out of the wood. Play around with it.
And in Texas, you get the really long window of about 3 hours to be able to pick that. Cool. All right, man. Thank you so much for taking the time to hang with us. I thoroughly appreciate it. When are you going to start getting bottles into New Zealand?
Hopefully, if I can get some laws changed, and I'll start sending them over there. That's the goal.
Awesome. Where can people find your spirits at the moment? We're obviously Texas.
Texas, you can actually, any state that has Total Wine in it, you can find our spirits. So if you got a Total Wine nearby, check it out.
Yeah, and I thoroughly encourage people to do so. It is, I have this thing with bourbon where I don't like the cough syrup cherry thing. I just yuck. And I've just realized, actually talking to you, I think that's probably one of the reasons why yours is very much at the top of the list for me when it comes to bourbon. But thank you so much, dude. 100% appreciate it, and we'll talk again sometime soon, I'm sure. Cheers, man.
Yeah, sounds good, man.
So a huge thank you to the team at Ironroot for dropping some knowledge for us again. I really, really appreciate it, guys. I also appreciate Adventures in Home Brewing for helping us out and making this podcast possible. So if you go to homebrewing.org/CTC for all your home brewing, So if you go to homebrewing.org/CTC for all your home brewing, home winemaking, and home distilling needs, that would be greatly appreciated. Also, a thank you to Gladfield, and more importantly than anything, a huge, huge thank you to the Patreons. Thank you so much, guys. All right, I'm out of here. Keep on chasing the craft. See ya.